Hi everyone, welcome. I'm down here in my wormery and I just got done taking care of a whole bunch of housekeeping chores. You can even see some of the bins that I just got done rinsing out over there. I commissioned one of my yellow buckets to store some castings. I had a few systems that were just storing castings, taking up space. It was kind of nice to just empty them, get them rinsed out, and allowed me to shuffle things around a little bit. A couple of my newer systems, those are going to be my newest systems as soon as we populate them with worms, but over there we got a couple systems in which we got migration of worms going on. And then as we make our way over here, you'll even see one of the systems that I took care of some housekeeping with, which was the bag. The bag was still kind of holding on to some castings. We were trying to bait some worms out of that thing because it seemed like the casting still had some stragglers in it, and we did manage just a few days ago to do the final haul out of worms from that thing, so it was nice to be able to empty that thing and feed the plants with the castings. I took the stuff straight outside. And the system into which we took those straggler worms out of and put them into was the newest system. A lot of times when you got an old system in which you've got castings that are still getting depopulated, it's usually the worms that came out of that stuff is the newest. So oldest to newest usually have a little bit of a tie up until you can really bring an end to the oldest. But here in the newest system, we were only in here 4 days ago when we popped in to put the stragglers in that we hauled out of the castings, and at that time we didn't feed. At that time only 8 days had passed since the previous feeding, and now 4 days later 12 days have passed. Besides the 12 days that have passed, we've now got some extra mouths to feed. Seems like we're ready to feed. I think the system's somewhere in the neighborhood of 32 days of age. That sounds about right. So we're going to get the system up on the bench and we're going to get them fed. I got some yummy foods for them. The stuff includes a few pieces of bread, some tomato, some cucumber. I've even got a few olives in here, olives that I picked off of a frozen pizza that I bought home recently. I don't like olives. So I'm going to get a glove on and we're going to get to work. Besides the yummy foods, I've got my little spray bottle on already since we've got bread, and I like to soak the bread when I put it into the worm bins. And the other thing I like to do, especially in newer bins like these, I like to add a little bit of grit, and my grit is pulverized eggshell. So let's uncover and get these little guys fed. It's kind of nice to be feeding a single bin. A lot of my videos these days are set up in such a way that we're feeding two bins at the same time, with the table occupied and the field of view of the camera occupied by two bins instead of just a single bin. And people do seem to like it when we get around to just feeding a single bin. I don't even know why. I just thought it might be interesting to start getting into these side-by-side setups, but sometimes I feel like I do, in a way, somewhat prefer being able to get a somewhat nicer close-up view of what's going on in the bin when only one bin is being fed at a time. So this paper here had just been a single sheet of newspaper that had been draped out across the top as sort of a top covering. Sometimes right beneath the covering plastic, I like to have a sheet of newspaper out there for the worms to play on, and we sort of patchworked it together last time we were in here to sort of resemble a top covering. But the newspaper is really pretty beaten up at this point. I think the best bet for this stuff is going to be to simply drop it down underneath the foods as sort of a foundation for the feeding. And even these slightly drier bits of material that are sitting out here on the surface, those also seem like they'd be a good candidate for being placed underneath the foods as a foundation for the feeding. Anything that's sort of dry like this is obviously not going to see a lot of worm traffic, since worms are pretty much incapable of spending any time in material that's exceedingly dry. They need stuff that's quite damp. So it feels good to be able to, once in a while, get that really dry stuff back into action by putting it down low within the feeding area where we know there's going to be a good bit of moisture coming off the frozen foods as they thaw, and where we know we're going to be getting a little bit more worm action on that stuff again instead of letting it sit there idle. So the feeding from last time must have included a corn cob, and a corn cob is just one of those types of foods that's really going to take a long time in your worm bin. The worms will eventually crawl down into the middle, and they'll be able to hollow it out, but this thing is still new enough that the inner core of this thing is still holding up. And it'll be months before they can break something like that down. A lot of people will take one of those and sort of snap it and break it as it becomes fragile enough to do so, and help it along by fragmenting it into somewhat smaller pieces so that the worms can come at it from more angles, and just by increasing the overall surface area of the material that makes up the corn cob. But I've got this weird habit of trying to just not interfere with the natural breakdown of certain foods, and corn cobs are just one of those foods that I sort of, I guess, prefer to leave them be and just see how they do on their own as the worms gradually make their way through the stuff and break it down. It's so funny, you know, one of the corn cob this size could end up turning into something maybe the size of, you know, one of my fingers, as the whole thing just sort of collapses and gets consumed slowly over time. But if I'm not mistaken, I've even got some corn cobs in some of my older bins that are even from feedings that I did maybe even at the end of last summer. So I mean, we're in the thick of summer now, so I mean, I've got corn cobs that I could probably pretty reliably date back to perhaps, you know, 9 or 10 months ago. And like I said, they're definitely showing significant signs of wear, but I always attempt to just let them be and, you know, not really help them much, although, you know, I'm not sure if I'll continue doing it that way. Wow, this one corn cob, just like in, somehow it feels super, super light. I don't know why. And you know what? I think I'm going to deviate from my normal mode of operations, which is to just leave the corn cob be, because I'm so curious I can't resist. Isn't that cool the way a corn cob looks inside? Look at that interesting pattern that it has. That is so cool. And you can see the worms are inside, and on this one, they've almost completely eaten this inner core, this tender stuff that they seem to really like to nibble out in the very beginning. And it was so weird how I was able to feel the difference, how that one corn cob was just so much lighter than the other two. All right, you know, just having a little bit too much fun here. I guess with all the, you know, tiring chores that I spent doing today, I hardly had any action with, you know, worms or exposure to hanging out with worms and doing stuff. So I guess when I'm, finally down to feeding one of my bins now, it's just kind of fun, you know, kind of fun to see what the worms are up to. Even in a newer system like this one, the worms are just really doing a number on those corn cobs. But I don't really see any leftovers of anything else. I can't recall what other things were fed last time, but whatever it was, they certainly did a number on that stuff, because I don't see any leftovers. So I've got all this stuff here, you know. I mean, we could have certainly bought in some fresh extra bedding. I've got my prepared bedding that we could have placed in here, but somehow it seems like just reusing all this stuff that we collected in the beginning off the top surface, just seems like we got plenty of nice bedding to place in right beneath the feeding. I don't know, I just like to usually put some sort of a bedding foundation in underneath the feedings, and then we can start coming in with this nice assortment of delicious foods. Just gonna lay in the old stuff, and then I think we can start coming in here with the new stuff. So we've got bread, pretty good sized hunks of bread. And if we were not to, you know, if we were to just put them in here without moistening them, I believe this bread would just sort of turn into a big brick of mold. And by doing so, the mold would just start sucking up moisture from the surroundings and everything. So I don't know, you know, I thought about even taking these juicy tomatoes and using them as the moisture source on the bread. But you know what, let's stick to the original game plan. I'm gonna grab my water bottle nozzle here and just put a little squirt of moisture onto these pieces of bread. So I do believe that by doing so, we're going to help the breakdown process of those pieces of bread. And this way we'll also, you know, kind of guarantee that we're not going to end up with a bunch of mold growing down in here too. So still like the idea of supplementing the moisture that we just added by also placing some of these nice juicy frozen items right on top of the bread too, so that the moisture supply just continues to seep into the bread so that the worms can just really gobble that stuff up instead of allowing it to just sit. And man, that corn cob, very surprising. Wasn't really expecting to see that sort of progress. And look at all this delicious cucumber peel. They're gonna love this. And as far as the olives, I really don't know. I mean, I've done this before. I've added olives that I've fished off of pizzas that I bought home because I don't really eat the olives. And from what I remember, the olives do seem to go pretty quick, so I have a feeling we won't see many leftovers of the olives when we get back in here. Before we can cover up this nice generous feeding, I think we can sprinkle in a little bit of this pulverized eggshell as a grit source to accompany their feeding, and then we can start backfilling the feeding zone. So now, just a quick reminder, there was that video from the check-in from only 4 days ago, and like I said, I added worms, so we've already got an established number of worms. But if you haven't seen that video yet, then I'll put a link to it up here in the corner, so you can review it and you can give me your feedback and let me know how many additional worms you think we placed in here a few days ago. And then, like I always do, I'll take those contributions of everyone, all those guesses, and come up with a worm bin population size estimate, which is one that I didn't establish on my own, but rather was established jointly by all of us. I think that's always a lot of fun. A lot of times I do take the population of a single worm bin and I break it into two so that I could launch 2 worm bins, but in the case of this system, we did simply take all the worms that came out of one system and use them all to launch this system. So this system is a somewhat more heavily populated worm bin than a lot of my newer systems are. Since we didn't split the population, we simply took these worms from their old home and moved them into a nice new home, and we kept the population at the size that it was when we bought them out of their old environment. So this is a pretty busy bin, and I've already updated my spreadsheet with my own personal estimate for how many worms I believe were added the other day, 4 days ago. And I don't want to reveal any of those values yet. I usually like to allow for a little bit of time so that people can get around to watching my video and kick in their estimates, and then the most time-consuming part is me doing all the math to average the numbers. No, I'm just kidding. I got a spreadsheet that does all that for us, so it makes it really easy. But yeah, I always do have fun collecting everyone's input and coming up with these unusual numbers, because it's not like just a simple round number that says, oh, I think we got 2,500 worms in here, whatever. It's usually some sort of a really oddball number, not a round number at all, because it is the average of multiple people's guesses. So it's just some sort of completely off-the-wall number that somebody that doesn't know what's going on might question, like, how'd you come up with that number? And then when I explain it to someone, I'm sure they'd be appreciative of the fact that it's probably one of the better ways to establish an estimate for something where you don't have the exact number on hand, because getting a number of different people's point of view on that usually results in a value that's very often very close to the actual true value. Alright, that was fun, I must say. I don't know. I guess I was in the mood to do this all day since I've been doing worm tasks and worm bin chores all day, but haven't really had an opportunity to fiddle with any worms, so it was kind of cool to actually visit in with some worms, especially one of my more heavily populated systems. There was no, mob scene of worms around the feeding area. They must have done away with all the more quick composting foods, and the corn cobs are just definitely not those sort of things that are going to attract the mob scene. You'll find worms inside of one, usually. Worms hanging out inside of one. And man, wasn't that one corn cob interesting to see how heavily it was worked already after such a short period of time? Alright everyone, that's it for the video. I got a little bit of cleaning up to do and a few things to put away, but I'm not going to waste your time with that. Before I go really quick, let me just say thank you. Thank you so much for watching. Hopefully you enjoyed the video. If you did, as always, please don't forget to leave me a quick thumbs up before you go. That's always really appreciated. And if you haven't done so already, please also consider subscribing to the channel. That's very much appreciated as well. Alright everyone, have a great day. Thanks for watching. Bye now.